Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 254 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. I get emails all the time from people asking me questions about the logistics of hunting Africa. What's the best airline? How do I take my rifle with me? What vaccinations do I need? How do I pay for my hunt? How much should I tip? What's the deal with taxidermy? How do I get my trophies home after the hunt? Where's the best place in Africa to go hunting? What time of year should I go hunting there? Etc. Now, those are all really good questions, especially for someone who has never been to Africa before. Additionally, a lot of this stuff has been on my mind lately as I finish preparing for the upcoming podcast hunt in South Africa this upcoming May 2023. So I figured this is as good a time as any to do a more in-depth podcast on the logistics of hunting Africa for a foreign hunter. So before we get started talking about that, and we will talk about that in depth, make sure you're on my email list. To do that, click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com and sign up for my free ebook on the best hunting calibers. You will get that free ebook when you sign up, plus you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday. These are entertaining and informative emails about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. I get feedback all the time from people telling me how much they enjoy receiving them and how much they look forward to hearing from me every day. So make sure you are getting my emails too by going to huntingguns101.com or by clicking the link in the show notes. Okay, let's dive right into things with the logistics of hunting Africa. And we'll go through this stuff more or less chronologically, starting with preparations for the hunt, planning for it, actually while you're there, and then after you return home. Now, the first thing I want to say before we talk about anything else is it's something I'm going to repeat several times in this podcast. This is Africa. Things are just different in Africa, regardless of where you are. A lot of people that listen to this show are from the United States and Canada, a lot of people in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, etc. But that is something that is especially important to keep in mind for Americans and Europeans who are just used to things being a certain way. And especially I myself have been guilty of this as well. Things move at a slower pace and are less hurried than what I am used to doing, how I'm used to operating here in the United States in my personal and my business life. So this is a big attitude adjustment for a lot of Americans and Europeans to deal with. Every country is a little bit different. The different cultures in all those countries just do have their own little flavor and way of doing things, and it's all great. But I will tell you that of all the countries I visited in Africa, Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, most people there have that general mindset. Some are more extreme in that mindset than others, but it's just generally, like I said, slower and just less hurried than we are used to here in the United States. I am very guilty of doing this myself, and so it is, like I said, it's just a big attitude adjustment that you got to have, and just be prepared for that from the get-go when you're corresponding with people in Africa about a potential hunt, when you're planning it, when you're actually over there, and then when you're dealing with stuff after you get home. It's not that people are trying to be rude or disrespectful to you. It's just things are different. This is their country. You are dealing with them on their turf, and so it's important for you to be understanding and respectful of how they do things. And really, if you adapt to that mindset while you're there and just understand and just kind of go with the flow, you're going to have more fun. You're going to get along with people better. It's just going to be less frustrating for you. So, like I said, I'm going to say that a lot. This is Africa. Just keep that in mind. Now, in that same vein, the first thing I want to tell you is when you are planning a hunt, I want you to budget ample time for it. Don't try to do things too fast or do too short of a hunt, if at all possible. It's important to just allocate the right amount of time for your hunt so that you have enough time to get over there, recover from your travel, and just get into the flow of things and spend enough time out there to get to know the people, get to become friends with the people that you're operating with on your safari. I'm speaking primarily about your professional hunter and the trackers and everyone that's involved in the staff and making your hunt go off. Enjoy seeing the animals, enjoy seeing the different terrain and vegetation and just the beautiful countries that you can see over there. You're going to Africa to hunt, but there's a lot of stuff that goes along with that experience. And so just make sure that you're, like I said, have enough time to do that. It's a shame to go over there and just try and wham, bam, boom, 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 get what you want, get on the plane and go home. It's your hunt. You can do that if you want, but I've found that a lot of people really enjoy a lot of things about being in Africa and hunting over there that they didn't realize that they would enjoy when they booked the hunt, if that makes sense. I think 7 days in Africa is the minimum amount of time that you should allocate for a hunt, and it should go up from there depending on where you're hunting and what you are hunting for. 7 days for a plains game hunt is fine. More is better, but understand, right? We all have jobs and lives that we have to respect, and those are the things that allow us to go on these hunts. And so it's also, and we'll talk more about this here in a minute too, but there's a lot of travel that is involved with doing this. And so really, if you're talking about a 7-day hunt, you're talking about being away from home for a minimum of probably 9 days, oftentimes more. And so, like I said, just allocate the right amount of time to do it. Don't try and be in too much of a hurry. Don't try to cram a million things into every day or work on too tight of a schedule or any of that stuff. And if you can't do that, then maybe it's best to delay your hunt for a year or two. When you may have more vacation time, when your family or your work situation may be at a spot where you have the time in your schedule that you can allocate to going over there and being able to fully enjoy and appreciate the process, as opposed to going over there and just being in a rush and being kind of stressed out with everything that goes on and jetting back home. That is just how I personally feel about it. It's like I said, and I'll say this a lot too. This is your hunt. You can do whatever you want with it, but this is something that I have found that helps me enjoy my hunts more, and as well as the people that I've advised on doing this in the past. Now, in that same vein, the next question is, when should you go? Well, once again, it depends, but I'll just go over some overall trends with you that are important. For the most part, and I'm speaking specifically with these countries in southern Africa that I have been to myself. It is a little bit different in Eastern Africa, but I can't speak to that myself just because I've never been there. In any case, Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, especially in that southern half of Mozambique, you have a pretty clearly defined wet and dry season. It is to different degrees in different parts of those countries, but in general, the wet season is going to run, say, from mid-November into March, April timeframe. Like I said, there's some variation there, but it's that time of the year. And at the same time, the seasons in southern Africa are reversed from what they are in the northern hemisphere. So if you're listening to this in Australia, New Zealand, other parts of Africa, or South America, then the seasons are the same as you. But for those of us in Europe and North America, they're the opposite. So July is usually the coldest month in most of these southern African countries. And once again, I'm speaking in generalities here, and the degree to which that is true definitely does vary. But you will have oftentimes your hottest temperatures in December, January timeframe, and your coldest temperatures in June, July, August timeframe. Now, June, July, August in those countries that I'm speaking about typically coincides with the dry season there, which is good. Now, I have talked about this in the past, where I went to Zimbabwe in February. 1 year. That was the only time I could get off work to go. And that is not a very popular month to hunt in Zimbabwe because it's very hot. It is raining a lot. It's humid. And because it's raining a lot, the bush is very, very thick and green. So the hunting is very physically demanding. And it's just also harder to find game because the grass is so tall, the bush is so thick. So for that reason, in most of these countries, they either have the hunting season closed, For instance, that is the case in Namibia. I think their hunting season there legally runs from 1 February to 30 November. So December and January, it's you can't hunt at all. And even if the hunting season is legally open, like it is in other places, like I think in South Africa and Zimbabwe, you can legally hunt all year round if you are so inclined. Even if you can do that, most people don't. That's a time for the professional hunters and their staff to take a little bit of a break. And they do other things like come to safari shows in the United States and in Europe and whatnot, and try and recruit new hunters to come over there for the upcoming hunting season. So we're looking at that, say, general March, April start to ramping up in September, October, November timeframe. So like I was saying, with the way the seasons work over there, the things will be still pretty hot in February, March, April, and then they're starting to cool off at that point, though, and they'll cool until June, July, and they'll start to warm back up in late July and August. September's hotter, October's hotter, November's even hotter, et cetera, et cetera. But say those later season hunts in August, September, October, and early November, where it may be getting hotter, the later you get in the season, the bush is more open, but the downside of that is it's hotter and you're right at the end of the hunting season, so lots of other people have been through that area before you get there. Now, Kevin Robertson has made reference to some of the time that he has spent afield doing training for learner PHs back when he was a professional hunter in Zimbabwe. They would do a lot of that training in October, right at the end of the hunting season or after it ended for a lot of people. And so at that point, most of the professional hunters and learner PHs are done with working with clients for the year, or they're nearly done. And so they're doing all this field work. And they mentioned many times about how in that area it was extremely hot, quote unquote, the suicide season there because it was so hot. The exact temperatures are going to vary depending on where in Africa you are. And like I keep saying, some areas this is going to be much worse or much better than others. But you're looking at temperatures in the 90s or over 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the daytime in those areas. And so not only is it really hard for the hunter who may not be used to dealing with that sort of heat and just being out in it all the time and sleeping in a tent outside, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also hard for the animals, too. They'll be more active at night and say, late in the evening and very early in the morning, and they'll bed down in the shade a lot during the daytime when it's that hot as well. So it all just kind of depends, and you're going to need to talk to people that are outfitters in this particular area that specialize in the animals that you want to go after. Certain animals are best pursued at certain times of the year and in certain areas, but just keep all of that stuff in mind there in general, what I'm talking about with the climate and just the weather patterns as far as hot and cold, raining, and that sort of thing. In general, though, the peak tourist season for a lot of those countries is June and July, and to a lesser extent, August. So May is kind of a sweet spot where you're going to hit, say, you'll be there before the peak of the tourist season, but the hunting is still pretty good, and the weather is still nice. And then it's going to get really busy June and July, and then into August, and then it starts to taper off a little bit in August, September, October, November. Plane tickets are going to reflect this as well. Like June 1st, a lot of places really a lot of airlines really up their prices for plane tickets going from Europe and North America in particular into Africa, just because that's when a lot of people like to go. If people are taking their kids that are still in grade school or even in college over there with them, that's when they're out of school, so that's when they want to go. That's when the weather is pleasant. And at the same time, too, not only is the weather pleasant in Africa, that's also when it is really hot in North America and in Europe, right? A lot of people in Texas and Florida and whatnot want to get the heck out of those places in July when it's really, really hot there, and then go to South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, whatever, where the temperatures are much more pleasant then. So I've been to Africa in July. I really enjoyed it. It was I was in Namibia on this particular hunt that I'm referring to here. I think it was getting down into the 40s degree Fahrenheit at night, and then up into the mid-70s during the day, and it was really sunny and just super nice. Very low humidity, just great. Wear a jacket in the morning, go out hunt when I would leave the truck and start walking. I'd take the jacket off, and it would get warm in the afternoon, and then when the sun would go down, it would quickly cool off, and just the process would repeat itself. So that was very nice, and so that is a nice time to go over there in many countries for a lot of animals. But like I said, the details do kind of vary from country to country and for different species. Additionally, keep in mind the phases of the moon. Once again, this is something that is going to vary depending on what you're hunting. In some areas, it's a bigger deal than others. My first trip that I was actually just telling you about, where I went to Namibia, I did not pay attention to the moon phase at all when I booked the hunt that I went on. I went on this hunt with my dad. We were there, I want to say, for about 12 days. And it just so happened that there was a full moon literally right in the middle of our hunt. And we noticed for a few days before the full moon, during it, and then for a couple days afterwards, there was a dramatic decline in daytime activity for some animals. Kudu and Gemsbok in particular. This area was kind of a bushveld sort of area, so I wasn't hunting Gemsbok, say, out in the Kalahari and other parts of Africa where the situation is different. But in this bushveld area, at least it was our perception that they were moving less during the day, and that was two of the animals that we were really after. And so when we got there, things were great. Lots of daytime activity. We did really well. Got a couple animals down there at first. We're having a lot of fun. We just kind of noticed there was like someone just turning down a rheostat every day as the hunt progressed. And then right in the middle of the hunt, we had this full moon. And then it slowly started to get better. And like the last couple days before we left were fine. And so it didn't ruin our hunt, so to speak. But I would say that if I had to do it again, I would have scheduled that hunt a little bit differently if I could have. I don't know if it was possible with our work schedule at the time. But live and learn, right? And so if you can, this is something I think it is better to hunt during a new moon is great, but really the big thing that you want to avoid is having a full moon right in the middle of your hunt. Say if you've got a full moon like on day one of your hunt, that's one thing, or say on the last day that you're going to be there, that's something else. But because then say if you have that full moon on the first day of your hunt, you're going to get there, and then it's just going to get progressively better every day that you're there as you kind of work into things. And then if you're there for 2 weeks and you got a full moon on the last day of your hunt or towards the end of your hunt, it's going to be great. And then those last couple of days, things will drop down a little bit for some species. Not a deal breaker either way, but like I said, just try and don't do what I did on that hunt in Namibia many years ago, where I scheduled it like an idiot right in the middle of my hunt like that. And once again, this is another disclaimer that I'm going to make many, many times. This is more important in some areas and for some species than others, but it is just something to keep in mind in the back of your head in general. All right, now let's talk about another hot topic, vaccines and medications, things like that. Usually this is not that big of a deal in most of southern Africa. Africa has this reputation for being just a crazy exotic place where you're going to go into the jungle and you're going to get some crazy disease no one has ever heard of, and you're going to have weird symptoms and then die. Things like that do happen in Africa, right? I mean, Ebola is a real disease that happens in Africa. But it's important to remember that regardless of what some people that don't know any better may think, quote unquote, Africa is not really a place. It is a gigantic, very diverse continent. And West Africa, where Ebola is much more common, is very, very different than Southern Africa or Eastern Africa. Indeed, I remember in the last big Ebola scare that we had in, I guess it was 2014, something like that, there were more cases of Ebola in the United States than there were in South Africa. And so while that was something people were freaking out about, it was not really something that was worth getting real excited about, at least in my opinion. There are things that you need to keep in mind, though, and just precautions you need to take. But it's usually nothing crazy or exotic. Every time I go to Africa, a few weeks or a month before my visit, I just visit my primary care doctor, tell the doctor, hey, this is where I'm going. Do we need to update any of my vaccines? Do I need any extra medicine, anything like that? For the most part, every time I've been over there, they'll give me a tetanus booster or something like that. I think one time I needed a typhoid fever booster. Usually, like I said, not that big of a deal. We're not talking about crazy vaccines. Yellow fever is something that people get real spun up about. Once again, that's a West Africa and a Central America thing. If you just do a Google search, go to the CDC or the WHO website on yellow fever, there's a list of countries that are there that if you have visited these countries or if you are going to visit these countries, you should get a yellow fever vaccine. But if you're going to Southern Africa for a typical plains game hunt, not something that you need to be concerned about. They will make you get a yellow fever vaccine to go to South Africa, for instance, if you have spent time recently in a place where yellow fever is a problem, because they don't want you to be sick and bring it into their country, but you don't need to be worrying about yellow fever going in Namibia or South Africa, or any of those typical Southern Africa countries I keep talking about. So just, if you're concerned about it, just look it up on a reputable website like that. See if you are visiting or have visited any of the countries on the list. And if you're not, don't worry about it. Move on to other things. Some parts of Southern Africa do have a malaria problem, though. Some parts of South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, some parts of Botswana and Namibia, but it's not the entire countries. If you look on the websites that talk about this, there's certain areas where it's an issue, and if you are visiting some of those places, then they will recommend that you take a malaria prophylaxis. Once again, this is good news compared to the way it used to be, though. There used to be a drug called mefloquine that was very widely prescribed as an anti-malarial medication, and there was all kinds of issues with it. And I don't think anyone uses it anymore because it was giving people weird dreams, and they were having psychotic episodes with it. Well, that was kind of crazy stuff. I took it on my very first trip to Africa, and I had to stop taking it in the middle of my trip because I was just having nightmares and everything. And it's one of these drugs that you take, and they give you a big list of warnings to be on the lookout for if you had developed any of these symptoms, if you start having weird dreams or you think about killing yourself or anything after taking it. And so for that reason, they don't do that anymore. Like I said, for the most part, that's not a drug that's very common. And the drugs that I have taken on my last few trips over there for malaria have much more minimal side effects, easier to take. You don't have to take them for as long before you go or after you get back. And so it's usually just not that big of a deal. I get them. I take my malaria drugs in accordance with the instructions, and then it's fine. You don't get malaria. That is something I would advise you to be very cautious about, though, because malaria is a nasty, nasty disease that it can kill you. You really don't want to get it. And so, once again, just go to your doctor, tell them where you're going, specific spot in that country if you can, and they'll take good care of you and make sure that you're set up. I also recommend taking ciprofloxacin and Imodium when you go over there. I had some bad GI issues on my first hunt over there. I did not have any of that stuff, and I was laid up sick with, like I said, just bad problems like that for a couple days in the middle of my hunt when I really wish I could have been out there hunting. And you're paying a couple $100 or more a day to be there. You don't want to be just laid up sick and not having a good time if you can help it. I got those on my second trip over, and the instant I started getting even mild symptoms of that stuff, I started taking those medicines, and it resolved itself, and it was not a big problem. So every time I go now, I take some Cipro and some Imodium with me just in case, and I actually haven't had to use that stuff on any of my subsequent trips. So just something to keep in mind there as well. Okay, next, let's talk about visas. If you are a citizen of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and most Western European countries, you do not need a pre-approved visa to visit South Africa. Now, citizens of countries like China, Russia, Vietnam, Mexico, a couple other Eastern European and Asian countries, you do need a visa to visit. Now, you need to look up the details based on the country that you are from and the country that you are thinking about visiting, because this generally holds true, but it's not always the case. If I recall correctly, I did not need a pre-approved visa to go to Namibia or Zimbabwe, but I did need a visa to get into Mozambique. Not a gigantic deal. I got in touch with the Mozambique embassy here in the United States before my trip, applied for the visa, sent them my passport, sent them some money. Then they sent the passport back after a little bit of processing time with my visa, and I was good to go. Not a gigantic deal. Just do a little bit of planning a couple months before your trip, and you and then do what you need to do otherwise. All right. In the same vein, let's talk about travel. Now, unfortunately, I'll speak to the Americans here first. There are no direct flights from a lot of places in the United States, even major airport hubs like DFW, Denver, Los Angeles, etc., to Africa direct. Flights, you only got a couple options if you want a direct flight from the United States to Africa, and really your option here is Johannesburg and to a lesser extent Cape Town. Otherwise, you got to go through Europe or Middle East. And so really Europe and South Africa and the Middle East, actually, surprisingly, with Emirates and Qatar Airways, those are the gateways into the rest of Africa. So if you want to go to South Africa, it's not super complicated. Namibia is a little bit more complicated. And then all the other places, you either have to go through South Africa or the Middle East for the most part to get there. So it's a little bit of a pain to get to some of these places, depending on where you live. Now, if you live in Europe, it's a little bit different. There's a good number of direct flights from Europe to Namibia, and so for a long time, that was a very popular, still is a popular place for Europeans to go hunt, and then it's kind of caught on with other places, especially in the United States here in the last 20 years or so. But otherwise, to get to Botswana, to get to Zambia, to get to Mozambique and Zimbabwe, you, for the most part, have to either go to South Africa first or go through Doha or Dubai in the Middle East. Namibia, you can fly through Europe and get there, and there are direct flights from the United States to South Africa on Delta out of Atlanta and on United out of Newark. Otherwise, you got to go to Dubai or Doha or go through Europe to get to South Africa. So South Africa, like I said, is really kind of your gateway to the rest of Africa, and it's a pretty big hub there, and it's not that big of a deal to get to South Africa, at least compared to the rest of Africa. Your flights are a little bit limited, though, like I keep saying. If you live in DFW, I'm sorry, you can go almost anywhere in the world direct from there, but you're going to need to go either to Europe, Atlanta, or Newark, or the Middle East to get there. But luckily, you got more options than used to be the case. And I'll talk about some specific examples of this stuff here in a minute. Now, when you are booking flights or planning your travel, you need to keep in mind a very important question. Am I going to bring a rifle with me or not? And that is going to really determine what I recommend that you do based off of that. If you're not bringing a rifle with you, you're going to rent a rifle and use a camp rifle in Africa, then your options really broaden a lot. And there's a lot of stuff that's just a lot easier when you're not bringing a rifle. And I'll talk about some examples of this here too. Now, it's more complicated with a rifle, but you can still do it. And you can get to darn near anywhere in Africa that's a popular hunting destination with a rifle. It's just harder. So how should you book your ticket? If you're not traveling with guns, then yeah, you can book a flight on Expedia or whatever service you prefer, and you just need to take into account your travel time, layovers, overall cost of your trip, really just like you would any other flight. Don't do that with rifles, though. It can work out fine, but oftentimes the thing that pops up as a great option in Expedia or whatever service that you're using that's inexpensive is a place where you may have a connection where the situation is just a little bit more complicated with guns, either due to the airline or the country that you're going through, or oftentimes both. So for Americans, the direct flights to Johannesburg on Delta and United are very good options. You can do those yourself if you want. You don't need to hire an outside travel agent. You just need to handle the Africa side of guns, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But, so for instance, I live in East Texas. I fly out of Houston a lot. I can go drive down to Houston, get a flight on Delta, go to Atlanta, get direct to Johannesburg. And that is a very simple, not complicated at all way to get guns over there. Just got to abide by the Delta regulations, which are very straightforward, and then the South Africa regulations, which are a little bit more complicated, but still not that big of a deal. If you're going on KLM through Amsterdam, or Lufthansa through Frankfurt, or British Airways through Heathrow, you can still bring guns. It's just more complicated, and you need to be a lot more careful with what you do, because a lot of the horror stories that people tell online are a flight like that, where you have a stop in a third country and someone didn't pay attention to the regulations or was just a little bit careless, and then things get really messed up. The guns don't make it. You get in trouble. You get delayed. It can be a mess. Now, I just mentioned that flight on Lufthansa to Frankfurt. The first time I went to Africa, I flew from Houston on Lufthansa to Frankfurt, and then Frankfurt down to Windhoek in Namibia. I brought guns on that flight. There's a little bit of stuff that you got to do with filling out paperwork, informing the airline. It's more complicated than going on Delta or United, but still not a gigantic deal. Qatar Airways is similar. Got to do some stuff, but not a gigantic deal. Emirates is more complicated. Flying through Amsterdam, Paris, Heathrow, they're all doable, just more complicated. Now, in those cases, I think it's worth getting a travel agent that specializes in this stuff. Travel with Guns is a very good company. So is Travel Express. I used Gracie Travel on my very first trip to Africa, and they also did fine. They'll help you navigate the mess of airline and country-specific regulations. Not a giant deal, but it can make your life easier. And oftentimes, this is a situation where it can be worth paying a couple $100 from help from a travel agent that knows what the heck they're doing with this stuff to save yourself some headaches when dealing with certain airlines and certain itineraries going over there. And there are even cases, I've seen this myself a couple of times, where you can get a screaming deal on a great economy or even business class ticket on some of these international flag carriers where you'll have to have a stop in a country outside the United States. But, it's more complicated with guns. So you pay $300 to get a travel agent to help you with that, where you could save $1,000 on your plane ticket. And in a situation like that, it can happen, and it's a no-brainer to do that. So just be careful about trying to do this yourself. You can do it. It's just harder sometimes and more stressful. But if you get like I said, you get a real simple itinerary where you're just going, on Delta from Atlanta to Johannesburg, and you're going to be hunting in South Africa, really, I don't think you need to pay a travel agent to help you with that unless you just really want to. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the ins and outs of flying with rifles. Especially in these countries that I keep mentioning that are big destinations for international hunters, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. They're used to seeing rifles come through the country, and so they don't really freak out about it or get real snooty. They realize the people that you're going to be encountering at the airport and with the airline, they realize that's a big part of their economy, and it's just not that big of a deal. If you're going to South Africa or you're transiting through South Africa, you're going to need to fill out what's called the SAPS 520. SAPS is the South African Police, and the 520 form is a form that they use for all their rifle stuff there. And it's most common with people that are visiting hunters getting a temporary import and export permit to take a gun into the country to hunt with. You look at this form for the first time, it's 8 pages long. They're asking for all kinds of crazy information, and it looks really intimidating at first. And the first time I had to fill this form out, it was basically just sent to me by the outfitter that I was going to be hunting with. They're like, hey, you're going to need to fill this out, figure it out. And that kind of irritated me that he didn't tell me how to do it. I figured it out. It's not super complicated, but I just didn't like how it was handled. And like I said, I did it, and I got there, and it wasn't that big of a deal. It's big, and it's intimidating. But you got to do it. For Americans, they're going to need to see a U.S. Customs Form 4457, which basically serves as proof that you owned this firearm before you left the United States. And so when you come back into the United States, you'll hand that the 4457 to the customs agent, and they will verify that the stuff that's on that form matches up with your rifle, and you'll be good to go. Then the trick with it is you have to go to a Customs and Border Patrol office before you leave, bring that form, bring your rifle that you're taking with you on the hunt, and they'll verify, okay, all right, this is your Winchester Model 70 and 375, and this is the serial number on it. They'll write all that down on the form. They'll stamp it, and they'll say, yep, I personally, agent so-and-so verified that this information on it is true. On this date, they showed it to me, and then you're good. That form is good forever as far as the United States Customs Service is concerned. The reason they care about that in Africa is that we really don't have a firearms licensing scheme here in the United States. So that Form 4457 basically serves as a substitute for that for American hunters. So you go there and you'll show them the 4457, the SAPS 520 copy of your passport, a letter of invitation from the outfitter that you're going with, and they'll say, okay, hey, John McAdams is coming to visit with me on a hunt these days. He's bringing this gun, and they're verifying, okay, right, this is the actual outfitter that you're going there to actually hunt with them, and they also want to see a copy of your flight itinerary that shows that you are going home and that you're not going to South Africa to live there and permanently import this rifle. So you do all of those things, and usually they're really good about approving that permit for you. Sometimes it takes a long time. I'll talk about that here in a minute. But usually not that big of a deal. It's paperwork that you got to do, and it's a little bit of a pain, but not a giant headache. Now, if you are from a different country, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, whatever, some country where you have to have a license to possess a firearm, instead of the 4457, the South African police are going to want to see your license from your home country. This is stuff that your outfitter should cover with you before you go. Some are better at doing this than others. But bring all that stuff with you. Usually not that big of a deal. Most other countries have a regime that is similar to that. In Namibia, I don't remember what the form was that I had to fill out, but I remember the same sort of deal. They wanted to see my 4457 and a letter of invitation from my outfitter, that sort of thing. And they do it as kind of pro forma. It takes a little bit of time. Then you're on your way with your rifle once you get there. Now, as far as types of rifles that are concerned, if you're bringing a bolt-action hunting rifle with you, typical bolt-action rifle, or even a single shot, or even a lever action, something like that, almost never a big deal. Don't bring an AR with you. Usually those are completely banned. Depending on the country, semi-automatic firearms that are quote-unquote sporting firearms may or may not be allowed. Usually they're frowned upon, but you need to kind of dig into the details a little bit on that if you wanted to bring something like a Remington Model 8 with you or something like that. Be very careful with it, but it could be a possibility depending on where you are going and what gun that you got. Handguns, you can take them to some countries, not others. In South Africa, the rule is you can take a revolver that is .357 caliber or larger. So you can't bring your Glock with you, but you can bring like I said, a quote-unquote bigger bore revolver like that is more commonly used for hunting. Rules vary from country to country, but in things like that, if you're not bringing just a very vanilla hunting rifle, you need to be very careful before you get on that plane trying to go over there because you might run into problems. As far as getting your stuff there, pretty standard. Take it in a locked hard case, unloaded. Usually the ammo needs to be in a separate container in your other checked bag. So when I go over there, I'll have a regular checked bag that I bring all my clothes and whatnot in. I will keep my ammo in a locked hard-sided case inside that bag. You can take up to 5 kilograms, which is 11 pounds of ammo with you. And then in a separate locked hard-sided case, I take my rifles. And inside that case, I will take other things that I also consider to be high value. Don't put ammo in there, but I'll take binoculars in there, my rangefinder if I'm bringing a separate rangefinder, my knife, that sort of thing. So you could put other things in there, usually with your rifles, depending on how much space you got. And as long as, just be careful with that you don't go over that 50-pound bag limit. Now, I talked about that 11-pound or 5 kilogram ammo limit. I've never had anyone actually weigh my ammo when I check in for a flight going anywhere. They'll usually, when I get to the desk to check in for my flight, I'll say, hey, I need to declare a firearm. It's in this bag here. And they'll say, okay, how much ammo are you bringing with you? And as long as you say that it is less than 5 kilograms or less, and as long as it's not obvious that you got way more than that and you got a super heavy bag or something, I've never had anyone give me a hard time about it or actually weigh my ammo or anything like that. But I've always been careful to make sure that I am under that limit just in case I get checked on, because I don't want to have to give up or lose that ammo that is oftentimes pretty expensive. Now, this is one of those things where diligence and care when you're booking your flights is important. You want that rifle ideally to be, and your other bag, to be checked all the way through to your final destination. It's a real pain if you have a connection flight. You go from your starting destination, you have some stop in the middle, and then you got to go and get your stuff from the baggage carousel and then recheck it back in for that other flight. Oftentimes, that's not going to be a case. Just be very careful that you're booking flights either with the same airline all the way through, where it's going to be checked all the way through, or with a code share partner airline like that, where they will take care of that for you. It's always important to make sure that your bags don't get lost, or reduce that as much as possible. But it's especially important when you're taking guns, because it can be a nasty mess if you have to mess with guns in the middle of your trip like that. So as you can see, hopefully, taking guns adds complexity to your hunt, but it's not a gigantic deal for most destinations. But it's also just more of a headache, and you have to pay for that extra bag that you're taking, and it takes time. And even when I'm traveling through very gun-friendly destinations on gun-friendly airlines, it's always something that's just in the back of my mind every time I travel. And maybe I'm just more nervous about it than I should be, but it's just a little bit of extra stress. And sometimes it's not worth it. And like I said, some itineraries are just much more conducive to traveling without firearms than others. And so I can understand why, someone, especially if you have a rifle that's just, it's not that important to you to take your own rifle over. You just, you want to have just a good hunt, and you trust that your outfitter has a good rifle for you to use, then okay, don't travel with a gun. That's fine. I interviewed Mike Arnold in episode 253, where he talked about hunting in Cameroon. That was a fantastic episode, and you should listen to it if you haven't already listened to it. But in any case, he did not take a rifle with him on that hunt. He used a camp rifle there, and I think it was largely just due to just the complications of traveling with the connection flight they had in the middle and getting it into Cameroon. He just didn't want to fool with it, and I totally understand that. He had a great hunt, and it made his life less complicated. And especially too, say if you are going to combine a hunt in Africa with just a regular vacation somewhere else, especially say if you're going to Europe or something like that afterwards, then it is really a lot easier in that case to not bring a rifle with you. And so I've done it both ways myself. I've brought my own rifle several times. It's very important for me to do that, especially in the line of work that I'm in. I'm always testing out new things and testing and checking stuff out and taking it on different hunts. And so I'm always bringing different stuff over with me. But I have gone over and just used a camp rifle before, and man, it was nice. If you have an outfitter that has a good rifle for you to use there, et cetera, et cetera. And it's whatever. If given the opportunity, I prefer to bring my own, but I don't begrudge anyone that wants to use a camp rifle, and it will make your life less complicated. Now, camp rifles can be hit or miss, though. Some are great. Some really get abused. So, your experience may vary with that stuff, but take a look into that before your hunt when you're doing your planning and see what the deal is. Now, this is a question I get asked a lot, so I'll answer it here. Do not bring ammo if you are not bringing a gun. Some guys, I think that, okay, well, I'm going to use a rifle over there, so I'm going to try and do someone a favor. They got a 30-06. I'm going to bring 30-06 ammo with me. Do not do that. That's going to get you in a lot of trouble if you try and do that. At the same time, do not bring ammo for a cartridge you are not bringing a gun for. Like I said, people ask me questions like that a lot, and I'm not exactly sure why, but that is the answer to them. So if you are bringing a 30-06 and a 375 over with you, you can bring up to 11 pounds or 5 kilograms of ammo total divided between whatever cartridges that you got. If you're bringing a 30-06 and a 375, don't bring 300 Win Mag ammo with you. Don't try and sneak some of that into the country to give to your PH as a gift. Don't do it. You can leave that 30-06 and 375 ammo with your PH if you want, and I'm sure they'll appreciate it, but that's the deal. If you're not bringing a gun, that's fine. But you got to use the ammo that they got there, and some outfitters have just different rules with that stuff, and they may charge you per bullet that you shoot. They may just charge you a set fee per day or just a set amount of money just for using their rifle. Just do that and deal with it. Ammo is expensive over there. They're not trying to screw you on the money that they charge you for that. They're really just, for the most part, trying to recoup their costs with that, so they're not losing money on you using their stuff. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is a peak season for tourist travel to southern Africa. Really, June and July is the peak of it. And like I mentioned earlier, plane tickets often are adjusted seasonally for demand. The cheapest flight I've ever gotten to Africa, I lived in Seattle. I flew on Emirates through Dubai and then down to Johannesburg. I did not bring a rifle on that trip. And the reason I went with that was because I got that flight for about $700, and I was able to pay off most of that just using reward points that I had on my credit card. So I think that flight cost me like $100 out of pocket or something like that. Now, like I said, I did not bring a rifle on that hunt. You can bring them on Emirates. It's just more complicated. I figured I got such a screaming good deal on my plane ticket that I'm just going to use the camp rifles there, and it was no problem. Now, that flight was also in March, too, so it was very much not peak season. You go in the middle of July, and it's going to be quite a bit more expensive. That Delta flight that I keep talking about is the fastest and simplest way to get there for most American hunters, but it's also one of the more expensive ways to get there, too. It's not terrible, but these flights, and honestly, it's comparable to a similar long-haul international flight going to almost anywhere else in the world, but it also just isn't cheap. So keep that in mind too. And that's why I say if you can go in March, April, May, there's benefits to doing that. Same thing in September, October, November. There's downsides, but there's also benefits on both the travel side and the actual hunting side. Now, additionally, I talked about just the stuff you got to do to get your gun into the country legally if you bring one. There's a time investment that you're going to have to deal with in this as well. If you go in the middle of the peak season into Johannesburg, so you're on that Delta flight going over in the middle of July, there may be 50, 100, or more other hunters on your flight. Some of them will be hunting in South Africa. Some of them have a connection in South Africa and then are going onward to some other destination in Africa. But everybody needs to clear their guns with the South African police before they go on to their follow-on destination, whether that's their hunting camp in South Africa or Zimbabwe or whatever. Well, there's only so many police that work in the airport to process that stuff, and there can be ridiculous lines to get your rifles approved because everybody's trying to do it at once. Remember, this is Africa. This is a place that can be a real pain point for people. You know, you maybe flew 2 or 3 hours to get to Atlanta, then you had a 15-hour flight to get to South Africa, and now you're finally there, you're exhausted. Well, then you got to wait in line to clear your guns there. So there's a monetary aspect and a convenience aspect just with your flight, with it as how it relates to bringing guns or not bringing guns. Because if you're just using a camp rifle, you get out, you clear passport control, you clear customs, meet up with whoever's picking you up at the airport, and go, and you're gone. And you don't have to mess with the lines with the South African police there. And so there's also that time aspect that I just talked to you about. That's less of an issue if you go in the off-peak season, though. April, May, not near. There will be other hunters going over there with you, but it's not going to be as crowded as it would be in the middle of the peak season. Now, the thing that is also frustrating to other people that try and save money on this and try and do it themselves is that there are companies in South Africa in particular that specialize in helping people navigate this system, where you pay them money, you send them your information, they do the paperwork for you, and will get a pre-approved rifle import permit for when you get to South Africa. They'll meet you there, have all the paperwork in hand, and then since your stuff is pre-approved, you go to the front of the line, get your stuff taken care of, and instead of waiting in line for maybe 3 or more hours, in some cases on a really, really bad day there, you may be out of there in 15 minutes. And so it's frustrating to those guys that decide to save $200 or $300, just do their own paperwork. They get there and they're waiting in line and they see all these other people that paid extra money. You know, if you could have it be akin to the Fast Pass at Disney World or whatever, where you're standing in line, you got all these people cutting in front of you, getting their stuff approved, and they get out of there faster. So that is a pain point that you need to be aware of. It's a bigger issue in some places than it is others, different times a year, more so than others, but keep that in mind when you're doing all of this stuff, both planning your trip and then if you want to use a third party to help you with that stuff. Now next, depending on where you're going and how you're getting there, you may have to overnight somewhere. I'll talk about this in an example here in a minute, but Frankfurt is a place where Americans often have a very long layover, and the same applies in South Africa, depending on where you're going. For instance, you may need to catch a flight to Port Elizabeth if you're going to go hunt in the East Cape, or Durban if you're going to go to KwaZulu-Natal, or Harare if you're going to Zimbabwe, or Windhoek in Namibia. Heck, some places in Limpopo province will pick you up in Polokwane, and they'll make you fly from Johannesburg to Polokwane, so they'll pick you up so they don't have to drive as far to get you in Johannesburg. So especially for Americans, your inbound flight into Johannesburg oftentimes will arrive in the evening the next day after you depart your home country, specifically Atlanta or Newark in this case. So you leave, for instance, you leave the United States on the 1st, you arrive in Johannesburg on your direct flight the evening of the 2nd at the earliest. Now there are flights on Qatar and Emirates that will arrive early in the morning on the 3rd. But regardless when you get there, you need to clear customs, get your rifle, etc. upon arrival. Now if you arrive in the evening, you'll need to spend the night in Johannesburg, then catch a flight to wherever you're going next the following day. So that puts you late morning or the afternoon on the 3rd at the earliest, depending on where you're going, etc., etc. So once you get to that place, then you might have a multi-hour drive on bad roads before you finally get to camp, or you may even need to take a bush plane flight from that spot to actually get to camp. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here in a minute, but I'm making a point. But that means for a lot of these people, you're going to need to spend the night in Johannesburg when you arrive. First off, Johannesburg can be very dangerous. There's places in that city that are extremely dangerous, especially for visiting hunters. And there are many places in Johannesburg that cannot accommodate you legally with rifles. Some places can, though. Now, for instance, the Afton Guest House and the African Sky Guest House are both very close to the airport. They both cater to hunters, and they are both very nice, safe places. Some places like that can also help you with your rifle import permits and then also give you sort of those head-of-the-line privileges that I just mentioned a minute ago. But you pay extra for that sort of stuff. So you pay a certain amount of money just to spend the night there, and they'll pick you up at the airport. You pay a little bit more for help with the rifle for the import process, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to factor all this stuff in terms of time and cost when you're hunting different places in South Africa and many other African countries. It's not just, in many cases, just that flight to Johannesburg that you got to worry about. You may need to get a regional airline within South Africa. It's usually not super expensive, but it's extra money. And then you need to factor in the cost of that hotel and the airport transfers, et cetera. And flying to a different country out of South Africa is more expensive than flying usually to somewhere else inside South Africa, but less expensive than the trip over there. But it just kind of all adds up, and it's things that you need to budget for. And so you got to just keep that in mind when you're doing your budget and planning these hunts. That hunt in Namibia that looked so cheap when you first looked at it, then starts to look a lot more expensive and more comparable to a hunt in South Africa when the price of all your travel and all of that other stuff is factored in. So here's a couple of examples that'll kind of illustrate some of these points I just made. So very first hunt in Africa, I went to Namibia, like I mentioned. Flew from Houston to Frankfurt on Lufthansa. Then I had a 12-hour layover in Frankfurt. That's pretty common, and when I just checked here a minute ago before I recorded this, still got a super long layover in Frankfurt to this day. It hasn't changed much. Frankfurt is one of those airports, at least when I was there, that it wasn't a great place, at least then, just to hang out. There wasn't a lot of places to sit and to charge your phone and that sort of thing. I was not impressed with it. It may have changed in the last 20 years, but what my dad and I did when we laid over there was we booked basically a quote-unquote day stay at a hotel in the airport. And so we went there, we took a shower, had a little bit to eat, took a nap in an actual bed in that hotel. Then we went back and checked in for our flight and continued on to Namibia to Windhoek in Namibia out of Frankfurt. Now on that flight was actually very interesting because, like I said, I was flying with my dad, and right after we left Houston, right? We take off out of Houston. The flight attendants are going around serving people food and beverages. They give him a Coke, and literally 2 hours into this 10-hour flight, he spills the Coke all over himself in his seat. And he did not have a change of clothes with him in his carry-on bags. And we did not get hands on our check bags until we got to Namibia. And so he had to wear those they did eventually dry, but they were wet for several hours, and then they were sticky after they dried, his pants and his underwear and his shirt, for the entire rest of that trip. And he was able to take a shower at the hotel in Frankfurt, but he had to put those dirty clothes back on. So good lesson learned there. Carry a change of clothes in your carry-on bags. Good advice, regardless of where you're going, but especially on a trip like this. That trip was a very, very long travel to get there. I started a stopwatch on my watch when I left my house in Houston, And so, we left the house, got to the airport a couple hours for our flight to check in and do all that stuff. And then with all that time, the flight over to Frankfurt, the layover in Frankfurt, the flight to Windhoek, the time clearing everything with the guns in Windhoek when we arrived, that took time. Then we had a 3-hour drive from Windhoek to the place that we were hunting at there. All told, that was about 40 hours of travel door to door. So that is a lot of time. It is maybe on the long side depending on where you're going, but it's not a ridiculous amount of time either. And indeed, there are places you can go in Africa where you're going to spend even more time in transit. So just keep that in mind. This is Africa. Go into it expecting that is the deal. And we arrived 2 calendar days after we departed Houston. So just keep that in mind. Now, all told, that was a good trip. I had a good time there. The travel was long, but it was smooth. You may or may not recall, Namibia really got a lot of publicity around that time. Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie had their baby in Namibia in 2005. And so there was a lot of people, and I went over in 2006, and there was a lot of people that were heard in Namibia for the first time due to that. And it was starting to kind of catch on as a big international hunting destination, especially for Americans. Like I said, up until that point, it was almost exclusively a destination for Europeans that would go there. It still is very popular among Europeans, but those early 2000 years were when more and more Americans started to discover the country. And a lot of people ask me, hey, you going over there? You heard about this from Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie? And I was like, no, I heard about it because of the hunting, and I'm going because of that. So many people ask me about it because it was in the news all the time. It really started to get annoying. There was a lot of hunters on our flight going over there, but there were mostly Europeans that we met up with in Frankfurt. A lot of Germans, a lot of Austrians. Still the case to this day, but there's a higher percentage of Americans that go there. Namibia, like I said, is a solid place. Our bags were checked all the way through on Lufthansa, and at the time it was Air Namibia that we flew on. It's a different airline that you go to Windhoek out of Frankfurt on these days. But still, same deal. It's a partner airline with Lufthansa. Usually not that big of a deal. Safe airline, that has a good reputation for that sort of thing. No complaints with the travel on that trip other than the fact that it was just long. Now, my cousin Brian had an interesting trip going to Namibia a couple years later. So I went in 2006. I was in college at the time. I graduated college, went into the Army, and then I got wrapped up a couple years later into a big deployment cycle going to Iraq. And so I was my hunting was severely diminished there for a couple years. But my dad went back to Namibia in 2009, and my cousin Brian met him there. Brian flew, I don't remember where in the U.S. he went from, but he went through South Africa to get there. So he got into Johannesburg, had to spend the night in Johannesburg, and he got a guest house, one of the guest houses. I don't remember which one he stayed in, but he stayed in one of them, spent the night there, caught an early morning flight the next day into Namibia. Now, the problem that he ran into was his bags got lost. He brought a rifle case and he brought just a regular suitcase with all of his stuff and all of his ammo in it. His rifle case made it, so he had 2 guns, but no ammo when he got there. And he also had no clothes. I think he brought 1 change of clothes with him in his carry-on bag, so that was good. But other than that, it was kind of rough there for a few days. And I think he was there for about a week, and I think his bag, singular, showed up on day 6 of his hunt. I think like the day before he was going home, he got his stuff back. Now, he brought a rifle in 9.3 by 62 and another rifle in 45-70 on that hunt. He was not able to get 45-70 ammo until his bag showed up, but they were able to go to some just tiny little gun store in Namibia and get him some 9.3 ammo, and I think it was some real inexpensive basic 9.3 ammo that they got there, the European equivalent of Winchester Super X, but it worked great. It cost him more money than it would in the United States, but it was not ridiculously expensive, and it was not hard to find, and it worked great for him. It shot accurately, and it just hammered everything that he shot with it. He was hunting plains game on that hunt and worked great, so no complaints on that for him there. But the bag getting lost just really frustrated him, and he was fortunate in that, one, they do a lot of laundry on these hunts, and so he wasn't in too big of a pinch, and my dad is very similar in size to Brian, and so they were able to share clothes, and it was fine on that hunt. A little bit of frustration, not a giant deal though. Now, a couple years later, my dad and I went together to Zimbabwe, and we were hunting Cape buffalo together. Now, on this hunt, we were hunting with an outfitter that was operating in southern Zimbabwe, very close to the South African border. We were hunting literally right on the Limpopo River, and I could look across the river into South Africa. So for that reason, we flew into Johannesburg. And this was actually the first time either one of us had ever been to Johannesburg. And the plan was to fly into Johannesburg, spend the night there, catch a flight to Polokwane, which is in northern South Africa. It's in the middle of Limpopo province, the biggest city there. It used to be called Pietersburg, for those of you that may have been to South Africa in the 1980s or early 90s. They changed the name to Polokwane more recently. And then the outfitter was going to pick us up in Polokwane, drive us across the border into Zimbabwe, and then take us to hunting camp. And so we flew in on the Delta flight, got in that evening, and this was the hunt I was telling you about where the outfitter just sent us the paperwork and said, yeah, take care of this stuff, figure it out. And I was annoyed with it, but we did it, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Now, fortunately, we went on this hunt in February, like I mentioned, and so there was nobody else going through there. I think there was actually one guy that he was a Zimbabwe citizen that was coming back from the United States, and he had a rifle with him for some reason, so it was him and my dad and me checking our guns through there. Not a big deal at all. We had the paperwork done. We did our stuff. We were out of there in 20 minutes. There was a guy from the Afton guest house that we booked a stay there. He picked us up at the airport, took us to the guest house. The big complicating factor with staying in a place in South Africa is that the guns have to be locked up appropriately. And they had a safe room that we put our guns in. And then the guy took us out to a restaurant in town. We had to pay for dinner, if I recall correctly, at this place. But he took us there and stayed, kind of sat at a table a little ways away from us. We could have privacy, but he was making sure that we were taken care of and that we were safe. Then he took us back to the guest house, and we spent the night there. Woke up, had breakfast early the next morning, and then a lady from the guest house drove us back to the airport. We checked our guns in there and in our bags, caught a South African Airways flight from Johannesburg to Polokwane, and that was no big deal. I think it was like an hour-long flight. And back to the guest house here for a second. Like I said, there's different tiers of service that you can pay for at these places. Just the room is a certain amount of money. Just the room in the airport transfers a little bit more. If they're helping you with your guns, it's more. They have their own kitchen and whatnot there, and so I'm sure for a little bit more you can pay to get food there, that sort of thing. I don't remember what it cost, but the price was very reasonable, and the level of service that we got out of that deal was worth the money in that case, because I felt like we were safe and well taken care of, and everything went very smoothly with that. So we get back to the airport, catch our flight to Polokwane, short flight, about an hour. We leave early in the morning, so we get there, 8, 9 in the morning, something like that. The airport terminal in Polokwane is very small, and the outfitter was there waiting for us, or PH, rather, was there waiting for us. He got all of our stuff. We got in his Land Cruiser, and we started driving north. We stopped in Louis Tricart, which is another little town in Limpopo province. Went to the grocery store there, and he said, okay, I'm going to get all this other food here. If there's anything special that you want as far as food or beverages, we'll make sure we get you taken care of with that. So we got everything that we wanted there, and then we went to a mechanic shop there, or I guess a Toyota dealership, and we picked up some parts for his Land Cruiser. And so the Land Cruiser is just packed, right? And this is a common thing that occurs in a lot of these hunts, where you got front row seats, and then the back row seats in the truck, and then the bed, and then you got the driver and the PH and one guy are sitting up front, and then there's one guy in the back, and then the back is full, the back seat otherwise is full of cargo, and then the back of the car, or the bed of the truck, is all full of other cargo. So we had stuff for his truck, our bags, our rifles, all the groceries, all that stuff. Go across the border checkpoint there at Beitbridge, or Messina, whichever side of the river you're talking about there in Zimbabwe. And then we got to get into Zimbabwe. And man, that place was crazy. So at this point, I had just gotten back from Iraq. And I'd spent basically a year in Baghdad, and that's how I had the money to afford this buffalo hunt in Zimbabwe. And South Africa is different from the United States, but every time I've been there, things have been pretty well put together. right? The roads aren't great, but like they're okay. And you have things, like I said, there's things function pretty well, and they had their own flavor, and it was just different from the United States, but it seemed pretty functional. Well, that was not the case in Zimbabwe. Like the place was just a zoo inside this the customs house or whatever it was there where we were crossing the border. There was just paper all over the floor. There were just people begging for money and stuff everywhere and just talking in all these different languages we didn't understand. It was kind of like what I pictured going to a lot of places in Africa were having never been there before. And that was not the case in Namibia either. Namibia was much closer to South Africa in those respects than was the case with Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe was having a lot of problems at the time. This was right on the heels of the hyperinflation that they had there. Things had evened out with that, but they were still really, really bad. And I'm talking with the customs agent there, and he's saying, okay, you need to pay me some money to get a visa to come into the country. And I didn't know this going into it, but I did have some cash, and said, okay, how much is it going to be? And I pay him the money, and we get the visa for my dad and me, and he gives me a receipt for it, which was more than I expected. And then we got to go talk to the police there about the guns, and it was weird because the people that were the so-called police officers that we got to get our rifle permit from were just wearing regular civilian clothes. They weren't wearing uniforms, and so to this day, I'm not certain they were actually police officers or if they were just regular people that were trying to shake us down for money. But they want to see our SAPS 520, and then they want to look at the rifles and all of this stuff, and then they start asking for money. And the PH and I talk our way through it, and they're like, listen, this is fine. There's hunting rifles, blah, blah, blah. And they approve us, and they actually didn't take any money from us. And but it was just very interesting going through there because, like I said, getting back from Iraq just the previous year, this situation was actually kind of less put together than even parts of Iraq that I had been to were. At least the Iraqi police wore uniforms and that sort of thing. But we make it through there, and there was a little bit of drama, but it wasn't that big of a deal. It was just more interesting than stressful getting through there. And then we go to we drive, it was probably about 3 hours at this point getting from the airport in Polokwane through Louis Tricart and through the border crossing. And then we go and we get some lunch at some little restaurant in Zimbabwe right on the other side of the border. And then, the roads got much worse going from South Africa into Zimbabwe. And we drive a little bit farther and we get to the house of the outfitter, which was kind of the base camp for where we were going to be hunting. And then we kind of cross level a bunch of stuff, and then we get to pick up the trackers and stuff with us as well, and unloaded some stuff at the house and put other stuff on. Then we drove, I think, about another 4 hours from there to the actual fly camp that we were on. The roads just got worse and worse as we went through there. And all told, it was about 8 hours from the time we landed in Polokwane until the time we got to camp. And like I said, that is not unusual, and that may even be on the short side depending on where you're going to hunt in Africa for this stuff. And we got to the fly camp, and then the hunt kind of began at that point. We got there, and that evening we went out and checked our rifles, and then we hunted for like an hour before the sun went down. And then the next day was our first full day of hunting to get out of there, or for the rest of that trip. Now, I'm not going to talk about any of the actual hunting experiences in this podcast. This is all just the logistics of getting there and getting home. Interestingly, though, I will say that maybe 3 days into the hunt, we get a phone call, or the PH gets a phone call while we're out there. It had very spotty cell phone service, but there was like one spot where if you just set your phone there, you get like one bar, and it was just enough where you could check your voicemails and every now and then make a phone call. Well, he gets a phone call a couple days into the hunt from the outfitter, right? So the outfitter's still back at his house, which was the address that we had put on our forms when we got our visas at the border crossing checkpoint. And he said, hey, we got some people from the Zimbabwe police here, and they're looking for John and Kevin, my dad and I. They want the numbers from the receipts that you got when you got your visas at the border crossing checkpoint. And fortunately, I still had them. I got through my stuff, and I got the receipt numbers, and I gave them to them over the phone, and they seemed happy with that. And then they left. They didn't give us any trouble over it. They just wanted to know what they were, and then they left. We found out later, apparently, that someone had stolen a bunch of money from the border crossing checkpoint, and they were trying to see how much money there was there and see how much had gotten lost and maybe who took it or whatever. And like I said, that's the last we heard of it. I gave them the numbers, and that was the end of it. And then we got our stuff at the end of the hunt, went through the same checkpoint, left Zimbabwe, no problem, back into South Africa, no problem. A little bit of a hassle, but not as big of a deal as getting in, and went home the same way we got there. This case, we didn't need to stop at the guest house on the way out. We just got into South Africa, got into Johannesburg in time to catch our flight that night, and we just left after the flight from Polokwane. But I just thought that was very interesting that whatever was going on at that border crossing checkpoint, it was crazy enough where there was people stealing money from the official government cash box that they had there for all this stuff. And so it's just part of the allure of hunting in Africa and traveling in Africa, right? I keep saying it. This is Africa. Things like that happen sometimes. Keep all your paperwork with you. If they give you a receipt, hang on to it. And just whoever's asking you for money, they're probably, from the government, and they're probably doing it in a legal manner that's in accordance with an actual fee, but that's not always the case. And there's many cases where you'll have a police officer or a customs agent or whatever that'll ask you for $20 basically as a bribe and insinuate that it's to pay a government fee, but it's not. And that sort of thing happens. And interestingly, a couple years later, when I went to Mozambique, there were signs everywhere in all the border crossing checkpoints I went through. I went into the country through one and out of the country through another one. But in both places, they had signs in there saying, hey, if you have anybody here that's asking you for money, you need to call this number. Because apparently there was a certain way that they were collecting their fees that was supposed to be done in a way that was supposed to cut down on bribery. And they were at least paying lip service to the idea that they're trying to crack down on the corruption with that stuff. So I thought that was very interesting in light of my experience in Zimbabwe a couple years previously. And so that hunt the hunt itself was much longer going into Zimbabwe versus Namibia, and the travel there was longer as well, just a whole lot more involved in it. With the multiple flights that I had to take within Africa, spend the night somewhere, the long car ride, going from one African country into another is just more complicated. Like I said, it went, for the most part, pretty smoothly, about as smooth as you can ask for in a situation like that. But it's just, once again, something to keep in mind. Remember, this is Africa. Wild things happen sometimes. Just always try and be polite and roll with the punches on that sort of thing. And I'm glad that I didn't get real stressed out about how long it was taking to do this, because, right, you're on your way to a hunt. You want to get there. You want to get to the hunt. You want to get to the good part. Try and enjoy the ride. Enjoy just these experiences and the interesting stories I got out of it and all that stuff. Now, a couple years later, I went to South Africa to hunt, and very easy, very straightforward. This is actually probably the simplest itinerary I've ever had going to Africa. That was I once again took the Delta flight out of Atlanta, got into Johannesburg in the evening. PH picked me up that night, took me straight to camp, and it was good to go. That, I want to say, was about 24 hours total travel, as opposed to 40 for Namibia and about 50-something for Zimbabwe. That was also the least expensive of all the ones that I had over there, aside from the Emirates one that I had, which was kind of a fluke. But yes, yeah, so the fastest, simplest, and the least expensive as you're going to get there. None of them are really cheap or fast or anything, but the fastest with that stuff. And then I took that Emirates flight that I told you about. On another trip I went over was the trip I referenced where I went to Mozambique. That was the one where I had to send off for my visa a couple weeks before I left. I was a little stressed. I would get my passport back in time, but they got it back a couple weeks before the hunt. No big deal. Got it, flew into Johannesburg. The outfitter I was hunting with, it was actually the guys I work with. They picked me up there. They drove me to their place in Mozambique. I spent the night at the PH's house that I was with on the front leg of the trip. So instead of staying at a guest house, I stayed at his personal house. Then we had a really long drive to get from Pretoria into Mozambique, crossed at one checkpoint, hunted for a few days, came back, went through another checkpoint on the way back. That was more complicated than South Africa or Namibia, not as wild and crazy as the Zimbabwe experience that I had earlier. So that's just kind of a basic rundown of of possible travel itineraries that you'll have getting over there. None of those were very unusual. And like I said, there are others that are even more complicated and longer and more expensive than the ones that I just described. So once again, this is Africa. The travel getting over there is kind of a pain in the rear. It's less so for certain people, say like Europe. Your flight to get over there is quite a bit shorter than someone from the United States, for instance, but it's still long as well. Now, another question that I get a lot now that we're past travel is how the heck do you pay for the hunt? All right. You go back into the 1980s, 1990s, it was cash and traveler's checks. And the joke used to be, at the end of the hunt, you're signing traveler's checks until your hand is getting ready to fall off. So I paid for my first hunt over in Namibia primarily with traveler's checks. And that's what happened, right? That was not a super expensive hunt, but traveler's checks only come in certain denominations. I don't even remember. It may have been $100 traveler checks were the biggest ones they had, but I'd signed a bunch of those to pay for a $6,000 hunt, and kind of a pain in the rear, but whatever, right? Or you can just take a ton of cash over there with you, and then you're worried, are you going to lose it? Someone's going to steal it from me? Whatever. Traveler's checks have kind of fallen by the wayside in recent years. Cash is still a very popular way of paying for a hunt. But credit cards have become more popular in the last few years. Some places charge you a fee, so they'll have a cash price, or you can add 2, 3, 4, 5% to that, and you'll have your credit card price. But you get the convenience associated with the credit card if you go that route. Other places do not charge a fee for it. It just kind of depends on who you're dealing with. But bank transfers are another way of doing things that are pretty popular as well, and I've done that as well. So like when I hunted in Zimbabwe, I think my dad actually paid all the deposits and I paid him back, but he basically sent a wire transfer to the PH or to the outfitter for however much money our deposit was, and then he paid most of his balance, I think, with a wire transfer before we went over. I had a different view of it. I don't want to wire him money and then me not get my buffalo and then have to fight with him for this money afterwards. My dad had an issue with another outfitter where that exact thing happened, and it was a big pain in the rear for him. Where exactly what happened, he basically paid for the entire hunt in full, didn't shoot a buffalo, and it was not clear how much money was going to be owed for a trophy fee that would be refunded if he didn't shoot the buffalo. And my dad thought it was supposed to be this amount of money. The outfitter said it was this amount of money that was lower. He sent him that money back after a fight. A lot of drama associated with it. I did not want to go that route, so I brought a ton of cash with me on that hunt. But then I was stressed about having, I think I had $7,000 worth of cash with me, and I was worried, all right, am I going to lose it? Is someone going to steal it from me? Everything turned out to be fine. I shot my buffalo plus some other stuff, so I paid them at the end of the hunt cash. They liked that. In Zimbabwe, they switched over basically to using the U.S. dollar as their currency there after the hyperinflation nastiness that happened there. So they're always looking for more actual paper money, physical U.S. dollars getting into the country there. So that made them happy. And really, most places enjoy getting paid in cash as well. So there's pluses and minuses to it, but you can do it that way. Other places are mix of credit cards and wire transfers. Other places are just completely credit cards. So just kind of look into that before you go over there. See what the payment terms are, how much money you need to pay as a deposit to reserve the hunt, if any additional is owed before you go over, when the balance is due, how you should best pay for it, that sort of thing. For the most part, you probably do need to bring some cash over, even if you're paying it all with bank transfers and credit cards. Bring some cash over for gratuities and for incidentals if you want to do some souvenir shopping, something like that. Some places you can go to for souvenir shopping, you can pay with a credit card. But if you want to go to a smaller, quote-unquote, mom-and-pop type place to souvenir shop, especially a place that may be a little bit less of a tourist trap, you're probably going to need to pay cash when you go there. So just keep that in mind. They may take U.S. dollars or euros or whatever you use, or you may need to change some of that into the local currency when you get there. Your outfitter will be able to help you with that, both in paying appropriately for that stuff and changing money if you need to, and making sure you're not just getting just ripped off ridiculously with the price of whatever you're buying. Now, speaking of gratuities, that's just another thing I get a lot of questions about. It's an awkward subject. People don't like talking about it, but let's be clear here. Don't try and save money on your hunt by reducing tips. That's not a nice way of doing things. Now, the hunting is a service industry, and tipping is a way to encourage excellent service. So you need to when you're budgeting for your hunt, you need to budget, okay, I'm going to set aside a certain amount of money, and that's just part of the hunt. You have to look at it that way. If you don't, it's going to make you mad. And if you just decide you're going to tip very, very poorly or not tip at all, it's going to really make your outfitter mad and the people that you're working with there. Like it or not like it, that's just a fact of life. It is the way it is. So just consider that a part of the cost of the hunt. But that being said, tipping is voluntary, and the amount that you tip should be a reflection of the level of service that you get. Now, I will say this: if you decide that you're not going to tip someone, or if you're going to leave someone a very small tip, you need to have a really good reason for doing that, and you need to articulate that to whoever the boss is at camp before you leave. Be a grown man or a grown woman about it, make it clear that I'm not tipping this person, or I'm tipping them a lot less because they were lazy or they were unprofessional or whatever. It's fine if you feel that way, but you need to have that conversation at the end of your hunt and explain why you feel that way. Now, ideally, if you're having problems with someone during the hunt, your PH, a tracker, anybody else, right? They're being unprofessional, they're being lazy, whatever. You need to bring that to the attention of whoever is in charge in camp and say, hey, I don't like that this is going on. And they're going to do, usually, unless that person is a total bum or very unprofessional themselves, they're going to do everything that they can to fix that. Because they want you to have a good time. And they want you to tell your friends that you had a good time. And they want you to come back and all that stuff. And so if you're not happy about something, it may not be obvious to the people in camp that you're unhappy about it. So bring it to someone's attention and fix it. And then if it doesn't get fixed, then you can, act appropriately at the end of the hunt. Don't just tell everyone you had a great hunt and shake everyone's hand, give everyone hugs, and then just dip out without tipping. It's a great way to, like I said, make a lot of people mad, not get invited back, or, who knows what else can happen if you do that. So that very, very, very rarely happens, though. Probably 95% plus of hunts, people have a great time. Everybody gets along well. It's great. A small percentage of the time, there's some issues. It's brought to someone's attention. They get worked out. Everybody's happy at the end of the hunt. But probably less than 1% of the time, you get a real big problem like that. But with regards to tipping, discuss this with your specific outfitter. Sometimes they'll have different guidelines and whatnot, but if just you and me talking right now, for budgeting purposes, call it 10% of the total hunt cost. That's a good rule of thumb for tipping. So they call it 5% on the low end and 15% on the high end. So if you have a $10,000 hunt, trophy fees and daily rates combined, you don't need to tip people on your airfare or the taxidermy or anything like that. Just trophy fees and daily rates, $10,000 hunt. That works out to about a $1,000 tip. That's divided between everybody. The PH is obviously going to get the most, then the tracker, then you got the cook and the skinners and the cleaning ladies and that sort of thing. Once again, every place has their own way of doing things, but I personally, check with your outfitter beforehand, but I personally like to hand the money to each individual person, myself, at the end of the hunt, shake their hand, tell them I had a great time, thanks for their hard work. PH, all the staff, everybody. And usually there's going to be some people involved in the hunt that were very important to cooking or otherwise preparing food, cleaning, doing laundry, skinning your stuff. You might not be seeing these people on a daily basis or even at all, but they're very important to ensuring that you have a safe, fun, and comfortable hunt. And it's important that those people are recognized. And usually what will happen is the PH or whoever's the boss there will gather up everybody right before you leave, and you'll say your goodbyes, give everyone their money, shake their hand, and then get in the truck, drive to the airport, start the process of going home. And if I wasn't clear, like I said, most of the tipping I like to do in cash and in my currency. So US dollars. If you're from Europe, you can tip in euros, whatever. Usually what will happen is the outfitter or the PH will help those people exchange the money into whatever the local currency is if they don't want to keep it in dollars. But once again, every place has a little bit different way of doing things. Sometimes they might want you to change that money into rand or Namibian dollars or whatever. But like I said, just have that conversation with them, broach that awkward topic, and hash it out there like a grown man or a grown woman, and everything will be fine. Now, here's another question that I get a lot from people. No, you can't take the meat home with you. Everything that you shoot is going to get butchered, and you're going to consume some of it in camp, and then what happens to the rest of it will vary. Oftentimes, it will get consumed by some or all of the camp staff and their families. Some of it may be given to the local village, especially if you're in a campfire area, something like that. But rest assured, it's not going to be wasted. You'll eat some of it when you're there, and either the camp staff or the local population around there will usually eat the rest of it, and that's the end of it. And a lot of this stuff is just absolutely delicious. I think buffalo is fine. Nothing to write home about. It tastes like beef to me. Kudu impala, I think, are great. Gemsbok is even better. Mountain reedbuck, blessbok, and eland, I think, are outstanding. That is the best stuff I've ever had in Africa. Honestly, my dad shot an eland cow on a hunt one time, and that is probably the best meat I've ever had in my entire life. It was fantastic. And the nice thing about eland is when you shoot it, you get a ton of meat out of it. Just lots and lots and lots of meat. And so when you get there, oftentimes you'll be eating stuff that the previous hunter shot. And then once you start shooting things, once you get stuff on the ground, then you're going to start eating meat from the stuff that you shot. So the joke is, if you're going to hunt an eland, it's usually good to get that taken care of early in the hunt so you have that meat to eat for a longer part of your hunt. Now, when it comes to getting home, usually you get home about the same way you got there. So oftentimes you'll go through Johannesburg and or Europe and or the Middle East, something like that. But you got to take that long drive back to the airport, maybe a bush flight, maybe a regional flight to get there, that sort of thing. And for some reason the flight home is always just a lot longer and a lot less fun than the flight to get there. I have enjoyed every single trip I've made over to Africa, and it's always sad leaving and going back home. But it's always nice to get home and I see my family and sleep in my own bed and all of that stuff again too. So that is kind of just the wrap up of that side of things, really, with the travel and logistics of the actual hunt itself. I wanted to talk about taxidermy and whatnot, but gosh, we're an hour and a half in and I haven't even started on it. Let me hit the highlights of it, and then I'm going to do a dedicated podcast on this subject here. Actually, probably I'll do that once I get home from my hunt here in a month. And when I'm going through that stuff myself, I will talk about the ins and outs of that to you. All right, as an overview, when you shoot your animals in Africa, they're going to ask you what you want done with it. How do you want us to skin it? You want a European mount? You want a shoulder mount? What? They'll skin it to your specifications. They will salt it and dry it there in camp. Then, at some point, perhaps on the way to take you to the airport, perhaps a couple weeks later, at some point, they're going to take it to a taxidermist or a dip and pack agent. You will get in touch with that business, or rather, they will probably get in touch with you. The outfitter will say, okay, this is John McAdams' stuff. Here's his email. They'll get in touch with you, confirm, okay, this is what we got. This is what you want done with it. Is that correct? You will pay them for their service. Your stuff will go to a shipping agent when it's done at the taxidermist or the dip and pack agent. Then you will pay that shipping agent to actually ship your stuff home. Then it'll go to your home country. In the United States, there's a couple of different ports of entry where it'll go to clear Fish and Wildlife and Customs. Atlanta, JFK, Houston, Seattle, San Francisco, those are all big places where that happens. There's a couple more too. But they'll send it to one that's the closest to where you live. You'll either need to pay a company to clear that stuff for you or do it yourself. Clearing it yourself is not practical for everyone, but you can do it, especially if you're not dealing with a CITES animal. And most stuff that you're going to hunt over there isn't going to need any crazy paperwork. Elephants, lions, things like that is a lot more complicated. But, just you're shooting a kudu, an impala, buffalo, not that big of a deal. warthog, bush pig, primates, a little bit more expensive or more complicated, but still not ridiculous. But in any case, my dad has done it himself. I've had customers that have done it myself. Most people usually pay a broker to do it for them. But they'll handle all that stuff for you, and they'll charge you a couple $100s to do it. Then at that point, you can either pick it up yourself, depending on where it is, or they will arrange ground transportation to your home or to a taxidermist for finishing, depending on whether or not you send it home as a raw trophy that needs to go to a taxidermist for finishing, or if it was a finished trophy ready to hang on your wall. Timelines for this stuff vary, but we're looking at a minimum of about 6 months, more likely a year, oftentimes more, once again, depending on what you get done, where it's coming from, where it's going, all that stuff, before it's actually in your house. Now, the good news with that is, though, is that it spreads the cost out a little bit of paying for everything, right? When you, going back to the very beginning, you book your hunt, you pay a deposit at that point, then usually you don't owe any more money to the outfitter until the last day of your hunt, whenever that is. So that deposit you could pay a year prior to your hunt. Then usually after you pay your deposit, you book your airline tickets. Then you have your actual hunt. You pay for the balance of your hunt. You pay your gratuities. Then weeks or months after your hunt, oftentimes the stuff goes to the taxidermist or the dip and pack agent. Oftentimes they will want a deposit to start work, oftentimes 50% of the estimated bill on that stuff. So you pay that a couple months or weeks after your hunt. Then, depending on, once again, what you get done, where it's getting done, several months after that, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, you pay the balance of it. Then the stuff goes to the shipping agent, and then you pay them a couple of weeks, a couple of months after that, the money to actually ship the stuff home. Then it goes to your home country. Then you'll pay, after it arrives there, after it is cleared, you'll pay a broker if you are getting a broker to help you with it. Pay them a couple $100, or you do it yourself. Then you pay the ground transportation to get to your house, or you go pick it up yourself. So this cost is spread out really from the time you make your deposit until the time that you're paying your final shipping and broker costs. It may be 2 or 3 years that cost is spread out over. So something to keep in mind with all of that stuff. It's not like you're having to fork over a ton of cash just all in one fell swoop or write a giant check or something like that. Now, like I said, though, I will do a much more detailed episode on taxidermy here in the very near future, probably in 1 to 2 months. That is a subject I can probably talk on for about 2 hours itself. And gosh, I'm an hour and a half into this one here. But so hopefully that answers a lot of the questions with regards to the logistics of Africa. There is a lot of variation within that, depending on how you want to do things, where you live, where you're going, and that sort of thing. But hopefully that just kind of lays it out, gives you kind of a roadmap that you can go off of and go into the process feeling a little bit more comfortable. There's a lot involved in it. Things go slow over there. Africa is very far away from a lot of people, and it's just more complicated. But that is also part of the adventure. The unknown parts of it are the things that are the most scary to most people, I think, though, and that's certainly how it is for me. So I can sympathize with you if you feel that way too. But lots and lots of people do this all the time that are probably not as smart as you are, and so I know you can do it too if it's something that you are interested in doing. Now, in that same vein, I mentioned that there are some parts of this that they're just pain points, right? The additional time and money involved with follow-on flights, right? You're going to Johannesburg and you're going to the East Cape, and then you got to spend the night and get that other flight to get down there. The pain associated with doing the paperwork for your rifles when you get there, or having to wait in line for all these people that are cutting in line that have their pre-approved rifle import permits in Johannesburg. The pickup at the airport, and really going back to the pickup at the airport too, there's some places that are going to nickel and dime you with that stuff too, and same thing with the transport of your trophies after your hunt. It is annoying to me when I look at prices to hunt with an outfitter and say, okay, here's the price of the hunt. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to charge you $100 to pick you up at the airport, and then another $100 to take you back to the airport. And then we're going to charge you $100 to take your stuff to a taxidermist at the end of the hunt. And then we're going to charge you $20 a day to use our rifle, plus $5 for every bullet that you shoot. And then if you want alcohol on your hunt, you're going to charge you extra for that. And oh, by the way, the price does not include a 15% value-added tax. And oh, by the way, we're going to charge you 5% if you want to pay with a credit card. You tack all that stuff onto that original hunt cost and just watch it balloon in front of your eyes. That drives me crazy, and I hate that. And then the same thing goes with what I described in my original hunt, where like a dummy, I booked my hunt with a full moon right in the middle of my hunt like that. I didn't know any better, but I was kind of shooting in the dark with that, and it was frustrating to me. So those were all pain points that I have dealt with and that a lot of people deal with on their hunts in Africa. And so with all of that stuff in mind, that is kind of how I've built my business model for Big Game Hunting Adventures, is to solve a lot of those pain points for people. You book a hunt with us, you fly direct into Johannesburg. We'll pick you up at the airport in Johannesburg. We're not going to make you fly into Polokwane or anywhere else. Pick you up there, drive you straight to camp. There's no extra fees for airport pickup and drop off. Same thing with your taxidermy at the end of the hunt. I'm not going to make you use a certain taxidermist if you don't want to. And I'm not going to charge you extra money to take your stuff to a taxidermist. You can use any taxidermist within reason in the Johannesburg and Pretoria area or in Limpopo province. We'll take your stuff there at no extra charge. VAT is included in the prices. No extra credit card fees. Don't actually charge you extra for rifle rental either. If you want to bring your own rifle, then we'll take care of the pre-approved rifle import permit for you for no additional cost. And so you'll be one of the people that when you get there, you get that pre-approved import permit in your hand. And instead of waiting at the end of the line for 3 hours or more, if you come in the middle of the peak season like that for everybody else to get their stuff taken, you'll be one of those people that gets to go to the head of the line. But like I said, we're not going to charge you to use our rifles either if you don't want to deal with that. We've got good quality rifles that are they're well used but well taken care of as well. They have good quality Leupold scopes on them. Some of them have a suppressor on them that make them a lot more fun to shoot. And we use good quality ammo in these rifles that is appropriate for whatever game that you're after. Plains game, buffalo, whatever. All that stuff is included in the hunt cost. I'm not going to charge you extra for alcohol or for VAT or any of that stuff. You see the price. That's the price for a hunt of this length after these animals. And you can also pay with a credit card, both for your deposit and for your hunt balance at the end of the hunt. You can even put your gratuities on the credit card if you want. I still recommend that you tip in physical cash, especially to the camp staff there, but you can put it on a credit card if you want. No extra fees associated with that. I also have a hunter information guide that I give to all of our hunters that just kind of explains a lot of the ins and outs of what it's like in South Africa. I give you a packing list that's in there. I have pictures in there of what the airport looks like and where to go and where to meet the person that's going to be picking you up there, how to fill out the SAPS 520, all the other stuff that you need to fill out your rifle import paperwork, all of that stuff. Basically, everything that's annoyed me on a hunt in the past, or every question I have had or that I've had a client ask me many times, I've put in this information guide just to answer it, just because it's important stuff. And I know especially on that first trip over there, people like having that extra information, and it gives them peace of mind and reduces their stress level going over there. So you can just focus on having a really good hunt. And of course, our hunting is great too. Now, I will talk more about this, like I said, in that follow-on episode that I'm going to do later, but I'm also going to help you interface with the taxidermist and the shipping agent, and potentially also get you a better rate on your shipping and whatnot, especially on the shipping, than it would be if you were just kind of navigating this system by yourself. That's, like I said, everything that's annoyed me in the past and that is commonly complained about. These are things I focus a lot of my efforts on to make this as seamless and painless of a process as possible. Africa is an amazing place to hunt, and I want people to be able to focus most of their energy on going over there and enjoying all of the great things that are associated with that, and spend less time and energy worrying about all the other things that go into a hunt over there. So if you're interested in a hunt over there, but the logistics of a hunt make you nervous, or you want some help, or you just want a great hunt and you don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about all that other stuff, check me out at bestsafarihunt.com. That is my website at Big Game Hunting Adventures, and we will set you up with a great hunt over there. And if you don't want to hunt with me, or you don't want to hunt in South Africa, that's totally fine too. I hope this information that I have put out in the podcast today was very useful to you and kind of helps you navigate a lot of the complicated parts of a hunt over there, and that it helped you plan a fun and safe trip for you going over there to wherever you decide that you want to hunt. Now, before we wrap up, make sure you go to huntingguns101.com or click the link in the show notes to make sure you're on my email list. And to learn more about Hunt in Africa and take advantage of some of the assistance I will provide to you in the logistics associated with the hunt over there, go to bestsafarihunt.com. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.